The four main macromolecules are proteins, nucleic acids, carbohydrates, and fats. This video is looking at proteins. So we're going to look at the structure, how do we put proteins together, and what do they do? What are the different kinds of categories of proteins and how do they function in our body? And lastly, we're going to look at what kind of foods contain protein and how do we get those amino acids into our body so that our cells can function. If we look at this slide here, we can see that if we put amino acids together, we have a bunch of different individual amino acids. There are about 20 amino acids that our cells can use, and they all have distinct characteristics. When we put them together, we form peptide bonds. So peptide bonds are covalent bonds. So atoms are sharing electrons. These are very strong bonds. When we put these together, then we will eventually form a protein. So the protein will function for two main reasons. Number one is the sequence of amino acids. We get that from our genes. So we have DNA that codes for specific orders of amino acids so that we can make the right protein. So insulin, for example, is a protein hormone that regulates our blood sugar. It will have a very specific order of amino acids. We put those together and then it will fold. How the protein folds is very important for its function. If we look at a single amino acid, all amino acids have a structure around a carbon atom. There's a hydrogen, and then there is an amino group, and there is a carboxyl group. When amino acids are put together, the carboxyl group of this amino acid will combine with the amino group of the next amino acid, forming peptide bonds. And that will form the primary structure. We'll look at that in a second. The other feature of all amino acids is that they have a functional group. The functional group gives each amino acid its own unique characteristics. So tyrosine has this functional group. Different amino acids will have different sort of characteristics. This is all of our amino acids, 20 different amino acids. The functional groups give them different characteristics, like being polar. So these amino acids have slight charges in their functional groups. Some of them have a negative charge or a positive charge. Polar amino acids are going to be attracted to each other as well as negative or positively charged amino acids. And over here, we have the non-polar amino acids. So non-polar amino acids are like oil. Oil likes oil. So non-polar will be attracted to other non-polar amino acids. The other thing that is important about each of these amino acids is that some of them are called essential. Essential means that we have to get them from our diet. We have to consume them. For example, some of the ones that are essential, threonine is an essential amino acid. So is lysine and histidine, valine, leucine, isoleucine, phenylalanine, tryptophan, and methionine. They're all essential, so we have to consume them. All of the other ones, like cysteine or alanine, for example, our cells can make them from one of the other amino acids. One of the other things that is important is how the proteins fold. We have to have the right amino acid structure, and we have to have those functional groups that are interacting to make the protein fold into a specific shape. So the primary structure is the order of amino acids. We get the order of amino acids from our DNA, our genes. Once those amino acids start combining on the ribosome in our cells, it will start forming this secondary structure. So two secondary structures are called beta sheets, or sometimes called pleated sheets, where they have this sort of zigzaggy kind of structure, or alpha helices, which it kind of looks like a corkscrew. And these are structures that start to form as the amino acids are being put together during protein synthesis. The tertiary structure is the completely folded functional protein. So when the protein is completely folded into its specific structure, then it will function. Whether it's an enzyme or a membrane protein or a hormone, it has to be folded in the right way. Lastly, some proteins have a quaternary structure, which means more than one protein will be put together to have its function. So an example would be hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein where 4 different protein sequences are put together to form the final hemoglobin protein that will then carry oxygen. In this slide, we can see the main forces that make proteins fold. There's 4 main forces. One of them is hydrogen bonds. When you have a hydrogen bond, you have polar interactions. So there's a slight charge on the hydrogen and a slight negative charge on the oxygen. So this is slightly positive and this is slightly negative, and that will make those 2 atoms attracted to each other. Then we have hydrophobic interactions. So this is, again, it's like oil likes oil. So when you have non-polar hydrophobic functional groups, they will be attracted. So here's a non-polar amino acid, and here's a non-polar amino acid. So they are attracted to each other, making this protein bend and fold. Over here we have 2 amino acids that have sulfurs. Sulfurs will be attracted to other sulfur atoms, forming disulfide bridges that will also make the protein fold. And lastly, we can have ionic bonds. When you have a positive and a negative charge, opposite charges will be attracted. So this amino acid will be attracted to this amino acid. Hydrogen bonds, hydrophobic interactions, disulfide bridges, and ionic bonds. These cause the protein to fold so that it has the right function. When we look at how proteins function, we need the right amino acid sequence, it needs to fold the right way, and then we have a huge variety of protein functions. So we're going to look at some of the categories of functions of proteins. One of the main categories would be called enzymes. Enzymes increase the rate of chemical reactions. So all cells have multiple chemical reactions that need to occur, and without enzymes they can't happen. You will notice ASE at the end of any protein that is an enzyme. So in these examples, lipase is an enzyme that will break down lipids. Polymerase is an enzyme that helps to replicate DNA. Protection. Proteins that protect the body. So some examples would be immunoglobulins, which are antibodies. So whenever we have an infection, a bacteria or virus or fungal infection, our body will make immunoglobulins. They are produced from proteins. Fibrinogen is another protein, and this is important for blood clotting so that we don't bleed to death. Membrane proteins. Membrane proteins are really important. One of the main ones that we're going to look at in another video is called the sodium-potassium pump. And it is super important because it moves sodium out of the cell and potassium into the cell. And moving substances across membranes is the basic physiological process for all kinds of things. So if we have sodium-potassium pumps that are functioning properly, then cells are going to have a charge. All cells are slightly negative on the inside and slightly positive on the outside. They're positive outside because we have more sodium outside, and they're slightly negative because we have more potassium, and even though that has a positive charge, there's fewer of them. So there's a relative charge around cells, and that is because of this sodium-potassium pump. Other membrane proteins will move things across cells like ions, like calcium. So a calcium channel will move calcium, a sodium channel will move sodium. We also have membrane carrier proteins that will move, say, sugar or amino acids across a membrane. Cell recognition markers. Like on our red blood cells, we have either an A, a B, an AB, or no antigens on our red blood cells that help to allow our immune cells to identify self from non-self. Same with major histocompatibility proteins, or MHC proteins. They help our immune system recognize us compared to an infection. Contractile proteins. Think of muscle contraction. Whenever you want to contract a muscle, the proteins that are helping the contraction to occur are called actin and myosin. Anytime we need to move our skeleton, we need to be able to contract actin and myosin proteins. Transporter proteins help to move things throughout the body. So I mentioned hemoglobin earlier. Hemoglobin transports oxygen and carbon dioxide. And lipoproteins help to move lipids or fats through the bloodstream. Structural proteins are very important. We have structural proteins inside the cell and outside the cell. Structural proteins would be things like our cytoskeletal proteins and extracellular matrix proteins. Inside the cell, we have things like intermediate filaments that hold the organelles in place. Extracellular proteins would be something like collagen, which helps our tissues to stay really strong and it holds our cells together. Actin is another intracellular protein that helps our cells to move around. And lastly, our last category is regulatory proteins. And these would be things like hormones, like insulin, that helps to regulate blood sugar. So when we eat food, we make insulin, and that helps our blood sugar enter the cells. Growth hormone helps to regulate bone density and helps us to build muscle proteins like actin and myosin. Troponin and tropomyosin, they're regulatory proteins that help muscle contraction. So the actin and the myosin were the contractile proteins. Troponin and tropomyosin are regulatory proteins. There's a lot of different categories of proteins, probably over 100,000 different types of proteins in our body. So even though we only have about 23 to 25,000 genes, we have more than 100,000 proteins that have all of these functions. One of the ones I want to look a little bit more detailed at is enzymes. So if we look at an enzyme structure, this enzyme is composed of amino acids that form some sort of secondary structure and tertiary structure. So once it is completely folded, it will have active sites for the binding of its specific substrate. Enzymes function primarily on one specific thing. So in this example, we're going to look at lactose. Lactose is a disaccharide, so it's made of two sugars. And these sugars have to be broken apart so that we can absorb them. So if you drink milk and you get lactose sugar, we have to break that bond and we have to use an enzyme. The enzyme is called lactase. So if the protein lactase didn't fold properly, then this substrate wouldn't be able to fit into it. So the protein has to fold properly to be able to function. Once the substrate fits into the active site, then the enzyme helps to cleave or break this bond. And then we release our monosaccharides, the glucose and the galactose. At the end of this chemical reaction, the enzyme is exactly the same. The enzyme is not altered during this process, and we can use that enzyme again to break down another molecule of lactose. When we look at proteins, we have to have the right structure, we have to have the right folding. If they unfold, then they won't work anymore. So I want to look at an example. If we look at an egg, here we have egg proteins. Bunch of different egg proteins. They have a specific amino acid sequence. They have a specific folded structure, and they will function like egg proteins, whatever egg protein that might be. If we take away those forces that hold them together, that hold those proteins together, if we break hydrogen bonds or ionic bonds, then this is a denatured protein. There are two main things that will cause proteins to denature. Number one is increasing the temperature or adding heat. So when we cook the egg, we are unfolding the proteins. The other factor is the pH. If we decrease the pH, which means we are making it acidic. Like when we digest our food, we have hydrochloric acid in our stomach. So cooking and digesting denatures proteins. But that is okay because all we are doing is unfolding the protein. All of the individual amino acids that make up the protein, they are not damaged. And when we digest this protein, we're going to break them into the individual amino acids before we absorb them. So denaturing proteins, when we cook them or digest them, is okay. The amino acids are still fine. Sometimes amino acids are not necessarily incorporated into proteins. When we put an amino acid into a protein, it's called a proteinogenic amino acid. But sometimes we can use amino acids for other functions. And there's a few specific amino acids that I want to go through. So number one is tryptophan. Tryptophan is an amino acid that is used to produce the mood molecule called serotonin. Tyrosine is an amino acid that is used to make a few hormones. So one is epinephrine, 2 is norepinephrine, 3 are thyroid hormones, and 4 is dopamine. So tyrosine is the precursor used to make those molecules rather than being incorporated into a protein. Glycine. Glycine can actually, without any modification, be used as an inhibitory neurotransmitter. And it's nice because it helps make us feel calm, and it will help to combat neurotransmitters like glutamic acid that is excitatory. So glutamic acid or glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter. This helps us to think and learn and remember, but we don't want to have too much of it because excess amounts will cause anxiety. If you've heard of MSG, this is monosodium glutamate. So this molecule can actually stimulate your brain and make you feel like whatever you're eating that has MSG is very delicious. So food companies like to put some MSG in there to make you really enjoy that food. And then lastly, we have our branch chain amino acids, or BCAAs, leucine, isoleucine, and valine. These are important amino acids because they play a role in metabolizing glucose and fat. We can use them to make ATP, which is our energy, and they are important for muscle repair. So a lot of athletes will consume branched chain amino acids as a supplement to help with muscle building. So how much protein do we need? The average adult that has moderate activity levels would need somewhere between 0.5 and 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. Take your body weight, convert it into kilograms, and then multiply that by 0.5, multiply it by 0.8, and then you can see sort of a range of the kind of lower end of the amount of protein that you should consume per day. If you consume that amount, then you know that you're going to have enough amino acids to be able to build all of those proteins in your own body. But sometimes we need more. When do you need more protein? You need more if you're trying to build muscle if you're working out, and you might need somewhere around 1.3 to 2 grams per kilogram per day. If you're sick, making all of those immunoglobulin molecules by your immune system requires a lot of protein. So if you're sick, you need extra protein. If you have an injury, you've sprained your ankle, or you have surgery, you need your appendix removed, you need extra protein to repair all of those tissues. Extra protein can help reduce your appetite. So if you're trying to decrease your body weight, then you want to control some sugar cravings, then increasing the amount of protein you eat can help to reduce your appetite. And lastly, increasing protein will help to reduce the amount of muscle loss when we get older. So unfortunately, we start to lose muscle and bone density as we get older, so consuming a little bit more protein will help reduce that. What kinds of things do we have to eat so that we can make sure our cells have all of the amino acids that we need to either make proteins or to make neurotransmitters? So if we look at animal food sources, that's going to include things like chicken, beef, shellfish, lamb, and dairy, like milk and cheese. And we can also get plant food sources of protein. So whole grains, beans and legumes, or nuts and seeds. So someone that is a vegetarian would need to combine two of these categories to ensure that they get all of the amino acids. Animal foods are complete proteins, so they contain all of the amino acids. If we're going to get our amino acids from plants, we have to combine them so that we can make sure that we can get everything that we need. So how can you tell if you're getting enough protein? So we just looked at those factors. If you're sick or you have an injury or you're trying to build muscle mass, you need a little bit more protein. How would you feel if you weren't getting enough protein? There's 4 sort of main symptoms that people would feel if they're not getting enough protein. So skin and hair issues. So this would be things like really dry skin, rashy skin, itchy, cracked heels and elbows and things like that, or dry, brittle hair. Those can be signs of other things, but they're often a primary indicator of protein deficiency. Loss of muscle mass. If your muscles are shrinking, then you're not getting enough protein. It's a very obvious way to see. 2 other ways that you can kind of tell if you're not getting enough protein are maybe a little bit more subtle. One is if you get sick all the time. There could be other reasons if you have immune issues, but getting sick frequently can mean that you're not eating enough protein. Or if you have an increased appetite. So let's suppose you start working out and you need to have more protein to build muscle, but you're not eating enough for the amount that you're exercising. Your appetite will go up and you might start craving carbohydrates and sugar. That's an indication that you need to increase your protein intake. Eating more protein will help reduce those cravings and that excessive appetite, and you'll have enough building blocks to be able to build muscle.